Hello, everyone. This is Rob Orson with the Emerging Revolutionary War with our next installment of our Revelry, our 5 years now running podcast, talking to authors, historians, museum staff, just anyone interested in the American Revolution, updating on new research. Obviously, if you've been watching this lately, the past 2 years, really covering the 250th events across the East Coast here. I'm very happy to have my good friend James Bish here, who is a historian and author. We've had you on before, Jim, talk about Parson Weems. But today we're going to talk about a unit close to me because I'm born and raised here in Virginia. My half of my family is from Culpeper, and so the Culpeper Minutemen, which is if you're from Virginia and you've studied Virginia Revolutionary War history, it's a unit that's been really given lots of mythology and lots of lore behind their service. So, and Jim's been doing a lot of work in Culpeper researching and really getting the information out to the public. So, Jim, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Well, very welcome, and thank you, Rob, for having me attend here.
Yeah, so let's just jump in, and this is some may consider this a niche topic because it's a minute battalion in Virginia, but they're very important in how the Revolutionary War gets carried out in Virginia. So let's start a little bit, if you don't mind, Jim, just kind of talking about when the unit was created, how was it created, and some of the leaders that kind of lead the unit when they first get formed up in 75.
Okay, well, just to address your first response about their importance, most people in this town don't realize how important they are. I think the
Wow.
importance of the Culpeper Minutemen, they know the symbols, but the importance of them has kind of been lost in the last 150, 200 years. And when you really study them, you realize how really important they were, both to Virginia history and the national scene. As far as how they got started in mid-June, June 17th, 1775, we had the Battle of Bunker Hill. And coming out of that battle, everybody throughout the colonies knew that war was upon us. This was a serious war, and all the colonies need to get prepared. So the Second Continental Congress in early July pretty much told the other colonies, you guys need to start doing measures for war. You need to start building regiments, and we need to get serious about this because the British are serious. So that's kind of what prompted it. The Second Continental Congress kind of put that in place. In response, the Third Virginia Convention opened up in July 17th of 1775 with the primary purpose from the Committee of Safety to actually form regiments and minute battalions to make their manpower, their military power, so that they're ready for the upcoming war. And so it really comes out of those two things, the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Second Continental Congress, in addition to Virginia's Third Convention. And what Virginia's Third Convention came up with, they divided Virginia's 62 counties into 16 military districts. And each military district was either going to be at least two counties, usually 2 to 4 or 5 counties. Some of the independent cities were put in place as well, like Williamsburg. They were all a part of one of those 16 military districts. So that's what they did. They formed 16 military districts. Um, Prince William, or excuse me, Culpeper County included the three counties of Orange, Fauquier, and Culpeper. Culpeper being the center county, just like up where you're at, Prince William was part of Loudoun and
Right.
Fairfax County. So that was so all throughout the state they had 16 military districts. Those each military district was to create one 68-man company, a regular company or a rifle company. The legislation demanded that the western counties, and there were about 5 of these, or western districts, that they form rifle companies instead of regular companies, which would have been mostly smoothbore musket companies. And then they also added, for more of a regional defense, that each of the districts create a 10 company minute battalion. So each military district was to form a regular rifle company, one that would be augmented into what the legislation also stated that the Virginia would form the 1st and 2nd Virginia regiments. And those 1st and 2nd Virginia regiments would take one of those companies from the 16 military districts to form 2 regular regiments, and then all the regional 16 military districts would supposedly on paper have at least a 10 company minute battalion that they would have at need at response to whatever problems they had. So that's pretty much how the paperwork was formed that created all these throughout the colony of Virginia.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. When you look at it, the battalions, the minute battalions, when you look at that was 10 companies of 50 men, that's a 500 men, plus you added about 80 officers on top of that. So they were about 580 men total if they were fully manned. And the regular rifle companies that was supposed to be formed as far as the 1st or 2nd Virginia regiments, they were 68 men rank and file regiments, plus they had about 10 officers supporting them. So altogether, if all the military districts formed as they were supposed to, it meant that each military district was to form about 650 to 700 men, each military district.
Right.
So that's a pretty good manpower throughout Virginia.
So let's talk about some of these men, and because I think from what I've read, Culpeper, this minute company is one of the few that actually were able to fill its coffers of required numbers. Um, so who are the leaders of the unit who are the people that the unit's looking for leadership that are really kind of leading the recruiting effort for the battalion?
Well, from what my research shows me, there were quite a few. In Culpeper County, for example, we had John Jameson was the Culpeper County clerk. He was he was recruiting kind of in the central part of the county around Culpeper, as what it appears Edward Stevens was also recruiting this area a little bit north. You had James Slaughter that was recruiting in the southern part of the county. You had John Green that was kind of recruiting in the north and eastern part of the county. You had William McClanahan, who was recruiting in the western and northwestern part of the county. So they all seem to have their little areas. In Stafford County, very similar. Joseph Spencer was recruiting more in the eastern part of Orange County. You had Lawrence Tolliver was recruiting in the northern part of Orange County. So it appears that before the legislation was even signed, and the legislation that the 3rd Virginia signed, it finally was passed on August 22nd, 1775. But these men had well known ahead of time that what the legislation was going to say, and they were recruiting, it appears, probably as early as maybe even late July or early August. They were recruiting their friends, their local people around them, and they'd all set a date. Fauquier County, Orange, and Culpeper had pretty much set a date to muster in Culpeper at what was known as Philip Clayton Old Field. Philip Clayton was a major in the militia, and it appears that it was the typical muster site that had been for the militia going back years and years. So Culpeper County just happened to be the middle of the 3 counties. So it was chosen as the name of the district, and that's where the muster site was going to be. And it appears that they put the date September 1st, 1775 as the muster date. We do know that Joseph Spencer began rounding his men up. There's evidence in Orange County that he began rounding his men up. And on the last day of August 1775, his men were already formed, and they spent the night at the old Orange County courthouse area, which was the courthouse before Culpeper County broke away. It's just across the Rapidan River to the south. So that information, so his company, so it appears that all these men kind of formed their companies, and then they came to Culpeper, to the muster ground, with their individual companies in task. Now, when I say individual companies, the legislation said that there was going to be 10 companies formed, but it appears that there were at least 15 or more companies that came into the muster site. And not all of those companies that were recruited were at their full levels of what they needed. So it appears that some of those companies, as they came here on September 1st, that they some of those men that led those companies were also made leaders of the entire battalion. So they gave up their men to filter in and form the rest of these companies to make them 10 full 50-man companies. So that's kind of what it appears happened. They all came. Now, Culpeper, I really don't see any evidence of that. Culpeper was close enough to the muster site. I think they just probably all met here at the Culpeper site for the muster. But so that's kind of what appeared. It appears that between September 1st and September 5th, most of the men in Orange, Fauquier, and Culpeper were arriving at the muster site of Philip Clayton's field, which is Long Mountain Run, which is still a perfect place to muster. It's where Yow Meadow Park is currently.
It's a great park. Yeah.
So that appears how it started. They came in with a lot of different people, had recruits under them, and then they kind of filtered in where they needed. Obviously, for that, they needed a rifle company as well. John Green, that rifle company, I'm assuming that most of these rifle company men, they were supposed to be 68 strong. They probably knew who some of the better riflemen were. One also has to remember out here that Lord Dunmore's War had just taken place less than a year before this.
Right.
And Culpeper County provided the most eastern county that supplied forces for Lord Dunmore's War and Point Pleasant. So I'm assuming that there were many of these men, especially in that rifle company that had earlier fought in Lord Dunmore's War. We know a few were there, but we don't have a lot of the records to explain that. But it appears that John Green's rifle company formed within 2 weeks after muster. They were quickly ready to go.
So before we go farther, I forgot to ask this question, and it's an easy one, but kind of explain the difference of what a minute company is. You kind of did it really quickly, but for those watching might not know what a minute company is as a difference to a regular company. And why you think that's so important that this particular minute company was able to form so quickly. Like, what's the impetus behind this particular one being able to fill so many different companies? When you see other districts have a little bit harder time doing it, you don't read about those units in those districts. You read mostly about this Culpeper unit.
Yeah, this is what makes Culpeper so special. 16 military districts were supposed to form a minute battalion, and literally half of them never formed a minute battalion. And the other half, the only one that fully formed was Culpeper Minute Battalion. And according to what some of the recruits say in some of their pension records, it was fully formed within 3 weeks. Most of the minute battalions only formed maybe 2 or 3 or 4 companies of the 10-man throughout the entire state. So this is very unique here. To get back to your question, what's the minute battalion versus the regular companies? Regular companies were usually your more experienced men. They'd probably been in the local militias for quite a while. They were used to military drill. The local leaders knew who they were. They knew they had experience. So that's what formed in the regular company or the rifle company that John Green was put as the captain in charge of. And they knew that they were going to be part of either the 1st or 2nd Virginia Regiment once they reformed in Williamsburg. The minute battalions were different. The minute battalions come out of that minute experience where they're notified in a minute, you're in your local county or your town. At the minute's notice, you need to form at the normal muster spot to get ready for whatever local crisis, regional crisis you might have, kind of like what happened in Lexington and Concord with the Minutemen up there. So the minute battalions were meant to be more of a regional fighting force if they were needed to fight a regional concern. They weren't really manufactured or built to become a force in the colony itself as a fighting force. They were more local focused.
Right. And some of the leaders that you mentioned, Edward Stevens will have a very distinguished career throughout the entire war. Um, I wrote about him at Camden because he's commanding the Virginia militia at Camden, which wasn't a great day for Virginia militia, but then he's at Guilford Courthouse. And Stevens serves throughout the war. Talk a little bit about the Marshall connection too. John Marshall is such a big figure in American history, being kind of the beginning, not the beginning, not the first, but one of the strongest Chief Justices. But his family is connected to this unit as well, correct?
Correct. And that kind of gets back to an earlier question you asked about why was this unique? Why was this area different? And I think it was different because the leadership was here, and certainly the Marshall family was part of that leadership. John Marshall's father, Thomas Marshall, when you look at him and what he did here and throughout the war, he was another just a great leader.
Mhm.
He grew up with George Washington. He was from Westmoreland County, and he came out to Prince William County in the 1750s, early 1750s, married into the Keith family that was very influential. And they, of course, that was that part of the county that broke off to be Fauquier County in 1758. So when in 17 after 1758, the Marshall family is pretty much associated with Fauquier County. He'd served in the French and Indian War. He was in the House of Burgesses. Thomas Marshall was a surveyor for the Fairfax family for a while. Just wherever he was, there's just a lot of leadership. Chief Justice John Marshall later said that the man, I'm paraphrasing, that the man that he learned most from leadership was his father. And I don't
Mhm.
doubt that. When you look at Thomas Marshall, what he did during the war, it was pretty amazing as well. Thomas and John Marshall both marched out of their home of Oak Hill in Fauquier County in August of 1775. They left there. When they mustered here, the committee of safety named one of the great leaders from each of the counties. They named Lawrence Tolliver as the colonel. They named Edward Stevens as lieutenant colonel of the Minute Battalion, and they named Thomas Marshall as the major. So those were the three top leaders of this full 650 or 600, almost 600 man Minute Battalion. And of course, when they also started putting companies together, young John Marshall, who was 20 years old at the time, he was born in 55, and now we're talking 75, not quite 20 when he first came here on the field. He was named a lieutenant. And I think it's the leadership here that really makes the difference. When you look at Orange County, you've got Ambrose Madison is one of the officers. Of course, he's the brother of James Madison, who later became president. You've got Richard Taylor. He was one of the officers of the regular company, and of course, his son becomes President Zachary Taylor. I mean, you look at the connections, and you mentioned Edward Stevens. You've got John Jameson here. John Jameson was a Fitzhugh descendant. His uncle was in leadership in Williamsburg at the time. It just this area just oozes. You've got O'Bannon. You've got William O'Bannon. His son will be Presley O'Bannon. That was one of the great Marines in early history. And you've got out of this group, you've got leaders that their descendants were people like George Marshall, um, George Pickett at Pickett's Charge,
Mhm.
Martin Pickett and William Pickett were company leaders coming out of Fauquier Company. You have John Chilton family, long known for
Right.
leadership going back into the Northern Neck. You've got the Blackwell family coming out of Fauquier County that had earlier been a leader in Prince William County. So you look at the leaders here, and it just oozed off the chart. They were close to the Pendleton family. Edmund Pendleton, 4 or 5 of his nephews were here in Culpeper County. You've got the Randolph family. The Marshalls were close kin to the Randolphs through the Keith family. It's just a lot of leadership in this area. And to me, it always, in order to do something like this, it's leadership. Nobody, no
Right.
other of the 15 other minute or military districts throughout the state did this, but Culpeper did. And it all goes back, I think, is to the leadership, the great men that were here, honoring themselves, but also recruiting people, and recruits came here. I mean, it was pretty amazing when you look at the population of the Culpeper district at the time was a little over 20 some thousand military aged men, and they recruited almost 1,000 men out of that 27. So you're talking about 5% of the manpower. And today, if we did something like that, it would be like recruiting a 30,000 man army just out of this district. So it was
Right.
tough. There's a reason why Culpeper District was the only one to do it.
Yeah, I think that's fast and great answer. I think it's fascinating that this district, which was very rural at the time and still mostly rural today, changing a little bit, was able to fill those coffers so quickly. I think you're right. I think it's the leadership. Um, so these men are called together. They muster there in Culpeper in the field there, which is now, like you said, the park, which we'll talk about later on because there's some cool stuff to see there about the Culpeper men. Um, are these men coming and going, or when they come in to muster, are they staying there? Are they camping in the field? Are they bringing their own clothes? How are they armed? Lots of questions I'm throwing at you, but just kind of give us an idea for what the average person, comes to this muster site and what are they going through in these couple days and weeks as they're training. So like, what's a typical experience for one of these Minutemen?
Well, the Virginia legislation was asking men to bring their own weapons with them. Obviously, Virginia didn't have a lot of money for weapons. They were asking men, and certainly they depended on the men out here in the frontier to hopefully bring more than smoothbore, as they said, squirrel guns or anything like
Mhm.
that. So what we know here at Culpeper is from a 16-year-old at the time. His name is Philip Slaughter. He kept a diary, and that diary gives us some indication of what it was like. He said that the muster field was made up of tents and wooden huts, small wooden huts that people put together. It appears that once they were here, they stayed here. And that's the reason for that is because they were fairly short term here before they were requested to deploy. But
Right.
the field, it appeared, had probably 600 men mustered. They all signed in. They got their muster payment. They were told where they were going to be. Their companies were formed, and then they drilled. As I said earlier, the regular company probably was only here for 2 weeks. They probably had an idea who's going to fill that 68-man company, and they were quickly sent to Williamsburg at the request of the Committee of Safety and Colonel Patrick Henry. They become the first company to arrive of the military districts in Williamsburg, and as a result of that, John Green is made the first. The Culpeper Company is put in this as the first company of the first regiment. Now back here, the Minute Battalion, was continuing to form. They were drilling every day. It was a mess. I'm sure you get 600 men on that field
Yeah, I
camping
can
every night
imagine.
and drilling. And we all know what that is, especially in the fall if it rains a little bit, and what that field was probably
Right.
like. But they formed. They were given money, a little bit of extra money from the if they brought their gun, and hopefully most of them would bring rifles. We know about half of them had rifles. The other ones had smoothbore muskets. So the rifles were the rifle is really what makes the Culpeper Minutemen special throughout the wars. Is their rifle, their ability with the rifle. But about half of them had rifles. The other half had muskets. They, according to Philip Slaughter, they all wore pretty much unique. They decided to wear hunting shirts where they tried to color it. We think that the color was somewhat of an off green. We really don't know. Philip Slaughter said that the hunting shirts that our uniforms that we made were the color of the leaves of the trees. Now in September, we're in September now, and I'm looking out my window here in Culpeper, and most of the leaves are still yellow, but there are a few brown leaves that are falling. So we really don't know what he meant by that. But in portraying the Culpeper Minutemen, most of the people feel that it was some shade of green that was their muster color. They were creative. They put liberty or death on their
Right.
uniforms. They created a flag. This all comes from Philip Slaughter's diary.
Mhm.
They created a flag which has a rattlesnake on it, and "Give me liberty or give me death." They put Patrick Henry's words on it, and then they were frontiersmen. I mean, we were part of the western fringe of Virginia at the time, so they had bucktails and everything like that on there. They look pretty rugged. In fact, this unit later, when they get to Williamsburg, they said that about half the people in Williamsburg were scared the way they looked, because they looked like they just come out of the hills and
They
that. But
did.
and they did, and
Yeah, they
and so
did.
that's what we know about them. But the thing that's really crucial is that they formed in 3 weeks, according to a number of
Yeah.
men pensions. So we're talking probably the third or fourth week of September. This Minute Battalion had formed a full 10-man battalion. I mean, 10-company battalion.
Wow. I mean, yeah, that's a lot, and we'll talk about the park later, but you can imagine that area and that many men, that's a lot of people for that little community at that time. That's not a very big area. So having that many men dropped on you, logistically, I can't even imagine what that was like. Um, so you mentioned Williamsburg and you mentioned that they're only there for a few weeks. Let's jump into that. So they're mustered, they're training, and then they get a call, modern term there, but then they're called to Williamsburg. So what's the impetus behind that, and where do they go when they left Culpeper?
Okay, well, the impetus, I don't think they were expecting to get called. They were ready, but I don't think they were expecting. The trouble with those regular companies, Patrick Henry felt that those regular companies would probably be filled within a month. We know that John Green's company from Culpeper arrived in by mid-September into Williamsburg. So I think that what was happening, certainly George Johnston's company in your neck of the woods, Prince William, they arrived as the second or third company to arrive. But by the latter part of September and early October, only about 6 or 7 of the 16 military districts had their regular companies arrive in Williamsburg. And I think Patrick Henry got a little nervous that he had 2 half-fulfilled regiments. He did not have enough men to meet what Lord Dunmore's forces and his loyalists and all of that they were presenting, and kind of causing havoc along the James River, etc. And he needed manpower, and the manpower was slowly coming his way. And I think he realized, or he heard, that the Culpeper Minute Battalion had already fully formed up here in Culpeper, in the Culpeper district. So that probably was the reason it prompted him. We need companies quickly.
Right.
And even though this minute battalion was not supposed to be a full Virginia type of a company or regiment, they requested them to come down there, and they did. They went on the old Colonial Road, which from here to Fredericksburg, and then pretty much took George Washington's route down to Williamsburg when he was a Burgess, most of that common route down through like West Point. And they went. They arrived sometime in mid-October. And at the time that they arrived, there were only about 6 or 7 regular companies had been in
Hmm.
Williamsburg. So when you add the 10 companies of even though they were little smaller companies, but when you add the 10 companies of the Culpeper Minute Battalion, that brought up the forces of the First and Second Virginia. And immediately when they got there, they were put into action. But they were then kind of put under the Second Virginia. So the Second Virginia Regiment will be made up of about 6 regular companies, augmented by at least five of the Culpeper Minute companies. So I think it was just out of total necessity. This wasn't
Yeah,
supposed to happen. It was supposed
right.
to remain in this region, but I just think that that Patrick Henry was nervous, and he knew that these guys had formed here, and he needed the manpower and the leadership here. Within 6 or 7 days, took that trek to Williamsburg, and they were there.
Victim of their own success, right?
Pretty much.
Hey, you guys have formed up. You're a large force. All right, let's go. Um, so they get called to Williamsburg, and we've talked to our good friend Mike Cecere about the Battle of Hampton and about what happens there. But let's kind of review their service, Jim, at Hampton, and then we can go into Great Bridge as well, which I think is, if you've been to any Virginia Reservoir battlefield, you've probably been to Great Bridge, and they're really well remembered there at Great Bridge. But they're also at Hampton. So if you can talk a little bit about their service at the fighting at Hampton. I know we call it the Battle of Hampton, but battle is kind of a stretch. But talk about their service there and then their service there at Great Bridge, because I think they're really known for what happens at Great Bridge.
Yeah, they're the minute they get there, they're put under William Woodford for as a second regiment. The actually the day they get to Williamsburg, word is out about and I agree with you, it's not really a battle. I usually call it the defense of Hampton. It's
Good
more
word,
like a
but yeah.
skirmish, but it's really of a defense of Hampton because obviously a few days earlier there was a hurricane hit, pretty serious one, washed some of the British some of the supporters that had ships that were merchants and ended up on the shore. The Hampton residents kind of confiscated it, upset some of the British, and it resulted in the British were going to take Hampton and probably burn it to the ground.
Hmm.
There were quite a few patriots in Hampton, and once the Culpeper Minutemen battalion reached Williamsburg, word was that that's what was going on in Hampton, and they needed to get there as quickly as possible. So Woodford asked Abraham Buford, who was one of the company commanders of the Culpeper Minutemen, to form probably his 50 best riflemen, and they formed as a company. Now, most of these were probably in his company, but maybe not all of them. So he, along with Woodford, took 50 of the Culpeper riflemen, and they rode all night. They were given horses, and they rode all night in the rain to make it to Hampton by early that next morning. And there were at Hampton, there were two local companies, militia companies or minute companies already there. And then there was a one of the regular companies were there. So there was probably around 160 or 70 men there. But the real turning point was the riflemen of Culpeper. As the ships were coming in to land and take and destroy the town, the um, Culpeper Company, Minute Company, they formed, and they were head rifles, and those rifles were pretty accurate and deadly from 200 to 300 yards, which was beyond the range of what the ships could really do. And they did have some artillery on those ships, but the artillery had to be manned on the outside. And in order to man the artillery, you had to get in position that was open for the Culpeper Minute rifles to strike you. And that's pretty much what happened. Once the Culpeper Minute riflemen got there, as the ships were coming in, they kept them abreast because nobody wanted to man the weaponry on the ships. And one of the ships kind of ran ashore. The riflemen of Culpeper were so accurate that it literally kept everybody from landing at the town. That the Virginia militia or patriots, they really didn't have much in the form of artillery. So in the early part of wars, and Washington realized this too up north, that the riflemen were a very important part early in the war to be used as an artillery piece because of their ability for their range, getting up to 250 or 300 yards with some accuracy. It's been said that they tested both the Culpeper Minutemen and some of the Minutemen or the regular rifle companies coming out of Western Virginia into Pennsylvania, and they could hit a target pretty consistently about a foot square at 250 yards. So
Hmm.
that tells you how accurate those riflemen were. I mean, they lived by the rifle. They grew up with the rifle. A lot of those
Right.
kids, they
Right.
were good with the rifle.
All right. So Hampton takes place. We know Dunmore is very active in raiding and offering freedom to the enslaved who will join his cause, becomes the Ethiopian Regiment. Really doing all he can to really pardon my French, piss off anyone that anyone that was leaning to the patriot cause and really becoming persona non grata among Virginians. I mean, I think even some of the loyalists who were slave owners were mad that he was doing this, so he lost some support there. So he ends up, trying to connect with loyalists out of North Carolina. One of the more important places in Virginia at that time is down near what is modern day Chesapeake, Virginia, which is called Great Bridge, which is a bridge there over the river that connects kind of the road that goes south to North Carolina. And Dunmore's trying to make sure he stays in connection with those loyalists in North Carolina because um, he's really not getting the loyalist support that he needed out of Virginia. So get the Culpeper Minutemen down to Great Bridge, and talk about what they do there. Because again, as I said earlier, when if you were to study this at all in school, which very few schools cover this today, but I remember as a kid learning about the Minutemen at Great Bridge. And so what's their role there, and why do you think it's so important, and why do you think it's still remembered today in many aspects?
Well, it was very important as we'll go through and talk about it, for what could have happened afterwards if it wouldn't have been successful. But after Hampton, you're exactly right. That's when Lord Dunmore put out the ordinance about any slaves that want to break away. He'll give them their freedom, let them form a loyalist company or regiment, and which really kind of turned the tables both in Virginia on for support of him, of Dunmore, and also the Patriot cause. So that made a big impact. Meanwhile, after Hampton, what the Culpeper Minutemen were kind of doing is what everybody was kind of was guarding the river crossings, the fords, and things like that, so that Dunmore's his British forces and his loyalist forces couldn't raise havoc or dominate the region. So that's where they were put out initially. They were guarding, and I know Green's company in Culpeper was doing that, and probably most of the Culpeper Minute Battalion was also doing that. But as they formed under the Second Virginia, their main goal was to go after. They were trying to figure out a way to get across the James River. James river crossings are never easy. Um, think of the crossing the Delaware, things like that later on. They're just dangerous, but they eventually, with the Second Virginia Regiment, augmented by 5 companies of the Culpeper Minutemen, they made their way south. They crossed the James River, kind of pushing their way towards Great Bridge. Of course, Great Bridge had loyalist commitments, but it also had patriotic commitments as well. We were sending word to Norfolk or to North Carolina, wanting Patriot Minute Battalion or companies to come up and support what was going on here. So there, we were gradually getting word that North Carolina units were coming up here to aid us against Lord Dunmore as well. So all that was happening in November into early December. By that time, Lord Dunmore was building a fort, and right at Great Bridge in support, and to kind of be the place where they were going to muster and fight out of. We pushed up against on the opposite side. of the channel there at Great Bridge, and we were there for a while. Now this is a little unusual as far as intelligence at the time. It appears that Lord Dunmore either was receiving inaccurate information about the size of the forces with the Second Virginia and manpower coming up from North Carolina, or he was purposely giving his men numbers of forces that were less than what actually the Patriots and Second Virginia represented. We really don't know what the core. Some people think that he was given his forces less numbers, which would build their confidence of
Right.
attacking them. Because if you're telling them that there's a much larger army that you're going to have to go against, that might break the confidence level a little bit. But it appears that Dunmore had to know the number of forces on the other side, which probably with the North Carolina forces reinforces getting close to at least 900 and some men, compared to a little less than that for Dunmore's forces, just because Patriot forces coming up from North Carolina, etc. But of that force, almost 300 of those men are Culpeper Minute Battalion forces. 5 companies of the Culpeper Minute Battalion were part of that. And if you look at the overall number, just the Virginia forces there, the Culpeper Minute Battalion is about 40% of the Virginia forces fighting at Great Bridge. So 4 out of every 10 men at Great Bridge were out of this military district up here at Culpeper. And it's no other district. I mean, all the other districts that were men that were down there were pretty much in the southeastern part of Virginia, which was pretty local to them that were fighting.
Mhm.
But we were way out here down there. It was unique. I earlier mentioned that we had 10 companies in the Minute Battalion. As regular companies gradually begin to fulfill their obligations and roll into Williamsburg, after enough regular companies rolled into Williamsburg, it was decided that they did not need 5 of the companies that were guarding the rivers, and they sent those minute companies back to Culpeper. Lawrence
Okay.
Tolliver was sent back with about 500. Now, it appears that the 500 men that were sent back for a couple of reasons. One, they weren't as needed now as other regular companies were forming and falling under the 1st or 2nd Virginia regiments. 2, they didn't have enough weapons, enough clothing, enough supplies to supply them and everybody else. So it was requested that those 5 companies that were no longer needed of the Minute Battalion in Culpeper, that they give up their arms that were issued to them or anything that was issued to them so that they could supply the companies, regular companies that now had made it to their Williamsburg. So half of the minute companies, it appears, were sent back to Culpeper. What remained was those 5 companies, now all rifle companies, that were now with the 2nd Virginia at Great Bridge. And it appears that at Great Bridge, the two Minuteman leaders were Edward Stevens and Thomas Marshall. They were the 2 men that were leading the 5 companies of the Culpeper Minute Battalion at Great Bridge. And they were put to the left of the oncoming forces of the British forces, British and Loyalists and Ethiopian regiment forces at Great Bridge as fighting opened up in December, that early morning. And they were put on the left, but their range was so much more than the typical musket range
Right.
that when they came across, of course, you have the story of William Billy Flora, and
Hmm.
he was one of the sentries, and he was from a local company down in southeastern Virginia, and
Right.
who kept the British and the Loyalists away or held them up a little bit till everybody got early in the morning, got in their positions. But I don't know, you probably know Patrick Hannum.
Hmm.
Patrick Hannum is doing a deep dive into this, and I've been talking with Patrick quite a bit recently about what happened at Great Bridge and after, and especially looking at the Culpeper Minutemen. And what he also concludes is that the Culpeper Minutemen, because their accuracy with the rifle and what they did, they were the ones that were most important in stopping the advance of the British and Loyalist forces. Now, to be honest, if you look at that military event, it was almost like a suicide event for the British and loyalists to do what they
Right.
did.
Yeah.
They could
Right.
only walk across the bridge because it was swamp on both sides, walk across the bridge about 6 men across, following each other. So they were limited in just a really goose into a bottleneck of coming out of that. Were the defending forces on the other side that were being attacked, the Patriot forces of the Second Virginia and the Culpeper Minutemen, they could really focus where their marksmanship was going to be.
Yeah, and they had makeshift. I'm gonna call them breastworks, which is more formal than what was there. But they were undercover too
And they
as
were,
well.
and they'd been building those.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's you look at the war as a whole. It's not a very bloody battle as far as numbers go, but the fact that the Americans were able to win that fight, you pretty much frees up Virginia from British, incursions up until, Arnold arrives in 1780. It really frees up the state to kind of provide those supplies and men other places in the country. When Dunmore leaves after Gwen's Island, you know, it's pretty, I mean, it's pretty free of British influence until the end of the war, and it's all because of this kind of small fight, but as you said, a very important fight.
Oh, yeah, it was, and you're looking at it, the real difference in both of Hampton and Great Bridge were the riflemen. The
Hmm.
riflemen, they just were able to do it. The musket fire from the Second Virginia, um, they certainly stopped the advance of the British and the Loyalists, but the riflemen of the Culpeper Minutemen, they pushed them back, and it was pretty bloody slaughter there. There, because of the distance, they pushed the British, the Marines and the Loyalists back, and then they followed up that next day. They took control of Dunmore's fort. Dunmore receded back to Norfolk, retreated back to Norfolk, and then before long he was forced off. They had the burning of Norfolk in January, and then Gwen's Island, and they pretty much after that, he was begging for more forces coming in from Britain
Sure.
to support him. Never happened, but it was just a very important battle, as you said. Beyond that, I mean, most of the leaders of the Culpeper Minute Battalion by March, April, or May of 1776, after Dunmore is finally pushed out of the state and he leaves with all of his forces. The Loyalists, many of the Loyalists scatter. They leave as well, Virginia. So it leaves Virginia in a pretty good patriotic hands. As you mentioned, the we were free. Most of the leaders, Marshall, Jameson, you go down the line, Chilton, they all became leaders in Virginia regiments then, that
Right.
Continental regiments that go in and support Washington's forces. So if that battle hadn't been successful, or even Hampton, or even guarding against the James River, which the most of the Culpeper Minutemen were doing for those 5 or 6 months, it was critical in liberating Virginia. And once Virginia was liberated, you're exactly right. There was no war here until 1781. And
Right.
not only that, that the liberation of Virginia liberated the largest state, the most powerful state, the wealthiest state, so that the North was assisted. If Virginia Patriots would have lost that battle, who knows how long this war in Virginia could have lasted and how much support Dunmore might have received, and the impact that would have had on Washington's Continental Force up north for the rest of the war. It could have been just very dangerous. And in addition, Virginia is free. We're liberated. We form our fourth and fifth Virginia conventions. By the fifth Virginia Convention of May, 1776, we declare independence. We write our own constitution, and
Right.
the result of that is Virginia becomes the first state to declare independence. After that's done, we send Richard Henry Lee to Philadelphia and tell them, hey, Virginia's declared independence, being the first colony to do so. Why don't you guys get your act together and do it too? Which leads to the Declaration of Independence in the Second Continental Congress almost 2 months later. So Virginia took a big role here, and those Culpeper Minutemen, what they did at Hampton and Great Bridge, as a significant part of that of that force, especially the impact of the rifle company. I don't think they can be understated for how important they really were for, or overstated how important they really
Mhm.
were not only in Virginia, but for the outcome of the entire war.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating action. And you're right. I mean, it has large implications way beyond. It's a very short fight too, as you said. It's very short. It's a charge that get repulsed, but huge implications. So one thing that's always people have always asked me about this. So you don't see the Culpeper Minutemen come up much after Great Bridge. So what happens to the Minute Battalion at that point? Do they get dispersed? They merge into other units? What's the process for them after Great Bridge?
Well, after Great Bridge, they're still there through much of Norfolk. Two of the companies remain at Great Bridge in that area just as a guarding force. They're taking care of prisoners at Great Bridge after the battle, those that are in prison. So there's two companies left there, and then three companies go on to Norfolk with the forces of the 2nd Virginia. And many of those forces, including John Green's um, rifle company that's with the 1st Virginia. He's also their company's also at Norfolk. So we're trying to work that out. That has not been researched much at all
Hmm.
as far as where people are at. But at that point, we're getting augmented more by North Carolina forces, more Virginia forces are starting to arrive. But it appears by anywhere from February through to April that most of the Culpeper Minute Battalion are being relieved. Um, One also has to know this was a minute battalion. It was meant to be in a region here guarding
Right.
the home front. And now, as other regular forces are coming in, they're gradually getting relieved. But it appears that they are almost immediately, those leaders with many of the Culpeper Minute Battalion men are joining regular Virginia forces as we go from the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th Virginia regiments are being formed for the Continental Army. Many of them are in that. The 3rd Virginia, which I know many in Prince William County are part of the 3rd Virginia. There's a lot of Culpeper men in leadership in that
Yeah.
3rd Virginia as
Thomas
well.
Marshall being one of them. Yeah.
Marshall being one. You've got the Spencer, Captain Spencer out of Orange County. He
Right.
becomes one of the leaders in 7th Virginia. So most of those leaders that we see in Hampton and Great Bridge, Buford, all those guys, they just quickly join up with regular Virginia Continental regiments and join the fight under Washington. So some of them do return home, but most of them join Continental units after they were relieved of their Minutemen duties.
Yeah, you're right that they pop up in different units throughout the war, especially up there with George Washington. Play a big role in the Battle of Brandywine there at Birmingham Meeting House, the 3rd Virginia. A lot of those men are from Culpeper, and so yeah,
Man,
it's
that's a
interesting.
tough battle. They were beat up on that hill.
Yeah, it's tough. The Thomas Marshall. So as we wrap up, let's talk about some places people can go to learn more. I want you to talk a little bit about the monumentation, memorialization of this unit, especially there in Culpeper. We've already talked about Great Bridge, which is there's a great museum and small battlefield park there that interprets the Battle of Great Bridge, a great monument there to not just Culpeper Minutemen, but all of Virginians that fight there. But when you look at that monument, you can tell it's really focused on Culpeper. But talk about some of the places there in Culpeper for people to kind of visit and learn more and see how this unit has been remembered throughout time.
Well, throughout time, after the Revolutionary War, in the War of 1812, and then in the Civil War, Culpeper tried to revive. They formed Culpeper Minutemen units, companies that at least formed in other regiments. They referred to themselves as Culpeper Minutemen. This town has never forgot the Culpeper Minutemen. There are monuments to it, of course, when you come down Route 15 to where Route 15 and 29 join in Culpeper. The DAR put a monument up there in the 1930s to the Culpeper Minutemen as an obelisk. You've got down in the park at Yale Meadow Park, there's a huge monument that was put up in the last 5 years to the Culpeper Minutemen. Also, a little bit about the history. There's history markers there as well,
Mhm.
Culpeper Minutemen. This county, the logo for the county is the Culpeper Minutemen. That's on their logo. The
Right.
town logo is Culpeper Minutemen. So in those regards, they've been remembered over time and their legacy. But one of the things that people don't realize today is how important they were 250 years ago.
Mhm.
I confront a lot of Culpeper residents. They see Culpeper Minutemen stuff all around them, but they don't realize that they were different than any other militia or minute battalion at the time. They think that they were just like any other ones and we're just remembering them. And I try to convince people, no, they were not like every other minute district or military district that formed at the time. They were unique. They did something that nobody else did. And so the people presently need to be reminded how unique and important the Culpeper Minute battalion was and the entire Culpeper military district was compared to everybody else throughout the state. And that's what our events are focusing on. In late October, we've got a full week of events celebrating the 250th muster and deploy. I will say this, that we came to the realization that Yalmeadow Field is the largest muster, drill, and deployment site in Virginia in 1775, 1776. More men marched off of
That's
that because of Culpeper Minutemen than any other place in Virginia. And there are some of the minute captains that marched off that field never returned. James Scott, John Chilton, they marched off this field and they never survived the war. So
cool.
we're having three tours, leaders tours. On Wednesday, we're having a leaders tour. You can sign up through the Museum of Culpeper History. Leaders tours into Fauquier County on Wednesday, October 22nd. We're going to visit a lot of Chilton, Pickett, and Marshall homes and home sites. The very next day, we're going down to Orange County and we're visiting a number of sites. We're visiting Madison home sites. We're visiting Taylor, different places down there. And then Friday, we're having a full day tour here. And then Saturday, we're having a full day of events in Yalmeadow Park. Capped off by that night, we're having a large Minutemen descendant reunion. We're trying to get as many descendants from 250 years ago, those Minutemen, as we can to honor them. Patrick Hannum has given a keynote address about the Minutemen, and it's going to be a big day. We've got George Washington, we've got Patrick Henry, we've got Colonel James Monroe, we've got Culpeper Minutemen in the park all day long. So there's a lot of events going on that Saturday with a full day of bus tour going down to Hampton and Great Bridge on Sunday, the 26th. So we've got a lot of events coming up in celebration of the 250th.
So Jim, all right, as you know, I do tours too. We do tours, ERW. So how many of these tours are you leading? I'm looking at your flyer, by the way, and I'm going to put the website in our chat when we post this podcast. People can go to culpepermuseum.com and check out where they can register. But how many of these tours are you personally involved in leading?
Probably about all.
Yeah,
No,
that's what I knew you were going to say.
no.
So
Three of the tours,
Monday,
the main tours on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the leaders tours, those are totally me. Because I've researched the leaders. We're
sure,
visiting private homes, a lot of really unique places. The short tours I won't be doing on Saturday. They're just short little
right.
tours getting out. And then Sunday tour, that's kind of an SAR, Culpeper Minutemen SAR tour. We're getting a lot of support from down there. Myself and Patrick Hannum are going to be on all of these tours. Patrick's an expert when it comes to the battles down in that part.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to reach Jim Bish on October 27th, don't reach out to him until a couple of days after.
Exactly.
Well, no, this is great. I can tell you, as a public historian myself, it's really exciting to see all these events. I'm looking at them right now. All these events you all have planned down there. I do plan on going on one of these tours. I need to pick one of them. I can't do all of them like you're doing. I wish I could, but it's just exciting to see that this is being done. And I know that town, having family in that town's going to turn out a lot to that park. I just mentioned before we went live on our podcast that I was there recently and they have a beautiful mural there, on Sperryville Pike going out of town about the Minutemen. It's great. So it's just good to see that not just the town, not just the SAR, not just the museum, but the whole community kind of come around this event. And I'm glad you're involved with it. I've been on many of your tours before here locally in Northern Virginia, and they're great. So I promise when I go on one, Jim, I'll just sit in the back and I'll just stay quiet and take notes. Um, yeah, this is fantastic. And I appreciate you doing that. And again, I appreciate you coming on with us today and kind of talking about this unit, which you hear Minuteman and you think Lexington and Concord, right? You don't think about Virginia, but Virginia does have Minutemen, and it has a very important one that was raised in Culpeper. So it's a great story. Well, Jim, any final words before we sign off?
Well, everybody, please check out everything. You can either look at Culpeper Tourism for information about all the events, or go to the Museum of Culpeper History. They've got all the events. Everything's being ticketed through them. And we hope to see everybody to come down that week, or especially that Saturday. And if you are a descendant of a Culpeper Minutemen or Culpeper Rifle Company descendant, please come, because we're going to honor you that night. We're going to make sure everybody's recognized as a descendant there. And our big dinner is going to be held at Yell Meadow Park, because we thought it was important to be on the park where all those hallowed ground where all those men marched from to save Virginia and America.
That's great. No, I'm looking forward to being there. And thank you, Jim, for being with us again. Thank you for everyone for listening and watching our ERW Revelry. And we'll see you again in a few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.